You didn't abandon me. You were trying to protect me. Then I'll finish what you started, Dad. I promise.
A wealthy real estate magnate dies and leaves his devoted daughter just one single dollar. While her stepfamily greedily inherits estates and millions, she uses that exact dollar to buy his rusty old toolbox at his estate sale. What she pries from the false bottom of that box doesn't just change her life, it exposes a massive conspiracy. The mahogany-paneled office of Robert Hastings, senior partner at Hastings, Wright and Covington, smelled strongly of lemon polish and stale secrets. Rain lashed against the heavy paneled glass windows, casting long, weeping shadows across the Persian rug. It was a fitting atmosphere for the reading of a will, particularly one belonging to Richard Sullivan, a man whose life had been as turbulent and formidable as a New England squall. Margaret Maggie Sullivan sat rigidly in a high-backed leather chair, her hands folded tightly in the lap of her faded black thrift store dress. Across from her sat her stepmother, Patricia, swathed in an absurdly expensive veil and smelling of Chanel No. 5, and her stepbrother, David Reynolds, who slouched with the casual arrogance of a man who already knew he had won. Richard Sullivan had built Sullivan Builders from a single pickup truck into a multi-million-dollar empire in Lowell, Massachusetts. He was a man of steel girders, calloused hands, and quiet judgments. Maggie had spent her entire childhood trying to earn a nod of approval from him, a pursuit that had ended abruptly when she chose to study social work instead of corporate finance. Patricia had seized upon that rift, driving a wedge so deep between father and daughter that Maggie hadn't spoken to Richard in the 3 years leading up to his sudden, fatal heart attack. Robert Hastings adjusted his half-moon spectacles, clearing his throat with a dry, papery sound. "We are gathered to execute the final testament of Richard William Sullivan," he began, his voice devoid of emotion. Maggie's heart pounded against her ribs. She didn't want his millions. She just wanted a sign, a token, a few words in a legal document that proved he still considered her his daughter. Hastings read through the endless legalese, distributing the sprawling Sullivan empire. The historic colonial estate in Concord went to Patricia, along with the luxury vehicles and the offshore accounts. The controlling shares of Sullivan Builders, the commercial properties in downtown Boston, and the investment portfolios were handed over to David. David smirked, buffing his fingernails against his tailored suit lapel. Patricia dabbed at a completely dry eye with a lace handkerchief. "And finally," Hastings continued, his eyes flickering uncomfortably to Maggie before dropping back to the parchment, "to my biological daughter, Margaret Sullivan." Maggie leaned forward, holding her breath. "I leave the sum of $1, ensuring that she is legally recognized in this document, and cannot contest the terms of this will on the grounds of being forgotten." Silence dropped over the room like a lead weight. Maggie's ears rang. $1. It wasn't an oversight. It was a calculated, deliberate insult orchestrated from beyond the grave. It was a legal maneuver designed specifically to humiliate her and shut her out forever. "Is that a joke?" Maggie whispered, her voice trembling. "I assure you, Miss Sullivan, it is standard legal practice to prevent future litigation," Hastings replied gently, sliding a crisp, uncirculated $1 bill across the polished mahogany desk. It came to a rest directly in front of her. David let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "Well, Maggie, don't spend it all in one place. Maybe you can buy a pack of gum to chew on while you figure out how to pay your rent." Maggie didn't cry. The shock had frozen the tears in her tear ducts. She stood up, her dignity, the only thing she had left. She reached out, pinched the $1 bill between her thumb and forefinger, and walked out of the office without a backward glance, the sound of Patricia's hushed, triumphant giggling following her down the hall. 2 weeks later, the Sullivan estate sale was in full swing. Patricia, eager to redecorate the Concord mansion to her own garish tastes, had hired an aggressive liquidator to empty Richard's garage, basement, and study. Everything that wasn't tied down or worth a fortune was being sold off to the highest bidder. Maggie hadn't planned on going, but a strange magnetic pull drew her to the sprawling property on a dreary Saturday morning. She parked her battered Honda Civic down the street and walked up the long, winding driveway she had once known so well. Strangers were carrying out antique lamps, golf clubs, and leather-bound books. It felt like watching scavengers pick over a carcass. She drifted toward the detached 3-car garage. This had been Richard's sanctuary. Before he was a CEO in a bespoke suit, he was a carpenter. The garage smelled faintly of motor oil, aged pine, and the damp earth the scent of her childhood. In the corner, sitting on a folding table among a pile of rusted garden shears and old extension cords, was a battered, olive green metal toolbox. Maggie froze. She recognized it instantly. It was a 1970s Stanley toolbox, the very first one Richard had ever owned. It was the box he used when he was building his first houses, the box he had allowed 7-year-old Maggie to organize on Sunday afternoons. It was dented, covered in scratches, and heavy with rust along the hinges. Attached to the handle was a neon green estate sale price sticker. Someone had written on it in thick black marker, $1. Junk. Maggie felt a hot flash of anger. David's handwriting. He knew exactly what this box meant to her father, and he had priced it as trash. She walked up to the table just as the liquidator, a burly man with a clipboard, was walking past. "I'll take this," Maggie said, her voice hard. "Sure thing, lady. That'll be $1, the man grunted, not even looking up. Maggie reached into her pocket. She pulled out the crisp, uncirculated $1 bill that Robert Hastings had slid across the mahogany desk 2 weeks prior. She placed it flat on the folding table. "Keep the receipt," she said. She grabbed the heavy metal handle of the toolbox, the rust biting into her palm, and walked away from her father's house for the last time. The walk up the 3 flights of stairs to Maggie's cramped apartment in South Boston had never felt longer. The metal toolbox was brutally heavy, seemingly filled with lead rather than standard hand tools. When she finally kicked her front door shut, she dropped the box onto her tiny Formica kitchen table with a resounding crash. Rain lashed against her single drafty window. Maggie stood over the battered green box, her chest heaving, wondering why she had bothered. It was a piece of junk. It was a physical manifestation of a man who had chosen his wealth and his cruel new family over his own flesh and blood. Yet, as she stared at the faded Stanley logo, a wave of nostalgia washed over her. She remembered sitting on the concrete floor of the garage, her father showing her how to hold a hammer properly. "A tool is only as good as the hands that hold it, Maggie," he used to say, his gruff voice softening just for her. Determined to clean the one memory she had left, Maggie retrieved a rag, a bottle of WD-40, and a piece of steel wool from beneath her sink. She unlatched the rusty clasps. They popped open with a harsh shriek. Inside, the tray was filled with a haphazard assortment of old implements, a heavy ball-peen hammer, a set of flathead screwdrivers with cracked wooden handles, tarnished wrenches, and a scattering of oxidized nails and screws. Meticulously, Maggie began to empty the box. She took out each tool, wiping away decades of grime, oil, and sawdust. The repetitive motion was therapeutic, easing the tight knot of grief and anger in her stomach. She set the clean tools in a neat row on a dish towel. Once the top tray was empty, she lifted it out to access the main compartment. It was filled with heavier items, a rusted pipe wrench, a heavy steel pry bar, and a thick coil of industrial wire. She removed them one by one, grunting at the weight of the pipe wrench. As she lifted the last heavy wrench from the bottom, it slipped from her greasy fingers and dropped back into the empty metal base. Thud. Maggie frowned. She picked the wrench up and dropped it again. Thud. It was a strange, dull sound, a hollow sound. Metal hitting metal shouldn't sound like dropping a book on a wooden table. Curiosity piqued. Maggie grabbed a tape measure from her junk drawer. She measured the outside height of the toolbox from the base to the lip of the lid, exactly 12 inches. She then placed the tape measure inside the box, measuring from the metal bottom to the lip, 8 inches. Her breath caught in her throat. 4 inches were missing. There was a false bottom. Maggie's heart began to race. Her father was a master carpenter and a man who appreciated hidden compartments. He had once built her a dollhouse with secret trapdoors. She grabbed the heavy steel pry bar she had just cleaned. She wedged the flat edge of the pry bar into the seam where the metal bottom met the sides of the box. At first, it wouldn't budge. The rust and age had sealed it tight. Maggie gritted her teeth, braced her boots against the leg of the kitchen table, and leaned her entire body weight onto the steel bar. With a loud metallic snap that echoed in the tiny kitchen, the false bottom gave way. Maggie pried the metal plate up and tossed it clattering onto the floor. She peered into the newly revealed 4-inch cavity, the overhead fluorescent light flickering as if mirroring her racing pulse. The hidden compartment was lined with waterproof oilcloth. Resting inside were 3 distinct items: a thick, leather-bound ledger, a heavy brass key with a string tag attached, and a sealed manila envelope. Her hands shook as she reached into the dark space. She pulled the manila envelope out first. Written across the front, in her father's unmistakable, sharp architectural handwriting, were 3 words: "For Maggie, alone." Maggie sank into the rickety wooden chair, staring at her name. The $1 insult. The humiliating display at the lawyer's office. It hadn't been a cruel joke. It had been a distraction. A performance. She slid her thumb under the flap of the envelope and tore it open. Inside was a single, folded sheet of thick stationery. She unfolded it, her eyes rapidly scanning the ink. My dearest Maggie, if you are reading this, it means two things. First, that I am gone, and second, that you are exactly the brilliant, fiercely loyal daughter I always knew you were. I knew Patricia would auction off my old life, and I knew you would be the only one to see the value in my old Stanley box. I gave you $1 in my will because I had to publicly disinherit you. It was the only way to keep you safe from Patricia and David. They are not who they pretend to be. For the last 5 years, they have been secretly embezzling millions from Sullivan Builders, tying the company to criminal enterprises that I only recently uncovered. If I had left you the company or the estate, they would have destroyed you in court, or worse, dragged you down with the sinking ship. I could not let them ruin your life. Maggie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The stepfamily that had just humiliated her and stolen her legacy were criminals. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He had shielded her. She continued reading, her eyes wide. The ledger in this box contains every piece of evidence, every dummy corporation, and every offshore account David and Patricia used to siphon the funds. It is enough to put them in federal prison for decades. But more importantly, I spent the last 3 years quietly liquidating my clean, personal assets, the wealth they didn't know about. Maggie reached into the box and pulled out the heavy brass key. The string tag read, First National Bank of Boston, Box 814. The key belongs to a safety deposit box in Boston. Inside, you will find untraceable bearer bonds, gold certificates, and the deeds to properties held under a blind trust. It is worth over $40 million. It is entirely yours, Maggie. Clean, untaxed, and untouchable by Patricia. Use the ledger, take them down. Then, take your real inheritance and build the life you deserve. A tool is only as good as the hands that hold it. I leave my greatest tool to you. I have always loved you, Dad. Maggie sat in the dim light of her kitchen, the roar of the rain outside fading into complete silence. A tear finally escaped, cutting a hot path down her cheek. But it wasn't a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of profound, earth-shattering vindication. She looked at the rusted toolbox, then at the ledger, and finally at the brass key gleaming in her palm. The $1 inheritance had just bought her $40 million and the ultimate weapon for revenge. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, biting chill that swept off Boston Harbor. Maggie stood on the pavement outside the First National Bank of Boston, a towering fortress of pale granite and imposing Corinthian columns that looked more like a Roman temple than a financial institution. She was wearing her best blazer, a slightly frayed navy wool jacket, and clutched her worn leather tote bag tightly against her side. Hidden securely inside the bag, wrapped in a thick wool scarf, was the heavy brass key. She pushed through the revolving brass doors, stepping into a cavernous lobby echoing with the hushed, hurried whispers of wealth. The marble floors gleamed under massive crystal chandeliers. Maggie approached the concierge desk, her pulse thudding in her throat. I need to access a safety deposit box, Maggie said, her voice steadier than she felt. The impeccably dressed attendant barely looked up from his monitor. Name and box number, please. Margaret Sullivan, Box 814. The attendant's fingers paused on the keyboard. He glanced up, his demeanor instantly shifting from bored indifference to hyper-focused professionalism. Miss Sullivan, we have been expecting you. Please follow me. Maggie was escorted past the velvet ropes, through a set of heavy mahogany doors, and down a spiraling marble staircase into the subterranean vault. The air down here was cool, dry, and smelled faintly of aged paper and copper. They were met by the vault manager, a tall, austere man named Jonathan Hayes, who offered a sympathetic nod. Your father was a highly respected client, Miss Sullivan, Hayes said softly as he led her down a long corridor lined with thousands of gleaming steel doors. He stipulated that only you were to have access to this box, and only in the event of his passing. Hayes stopped in front of Box 814. He inserted his master key into the left keyhole and stepped back. Your key goes on the right. I will leave you in the private viewing room. Maggie's hand trembled as she slid the heavy brass key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying heavy click. She pulled the long steel drawer from the wall. It was nearly 3 feet deep and surprisingly heavy. She carried it into the adjacent private room, a windowless space featuring a single polished oak table and a brass lamp, and firmly locked the door behind her. Taking a deep breath, Maggie flipped open the lid of the metal container. Her father had not exaggerated. The box was packed to the brim. Sitting on top were thick stacks of antique gold certificates, and bound sheaves of bearer bonds, unregistered, untraceable financial instruments that belonged to whoever physically held them. Below the bonds were thick linen envelopes containing the deeds to a sprawling ranch in Wyoming, a high-rise penthouse in Monaco, and a secluded chalet in the Swiss Alps. All were held under an anonymous blind trust, a legal fortress completely invisible to the probate courts and Patricia's greedy lawyers. At the very bottom lay a certified cashier's check made out to Margaret Sullivan for $12 million, bringing the total estimated value of the box well past the $40 million mark her father had promised. Maggie sat back in the leather chair, staring at the unimaginable fortune. She was no longer the struggling social worker fighting to make rent. In the span of 48 hours, she had become one of the wealthiest women in Massachusetts. But the money, as staggering as it was, paled in comparison to the burning need for justice that had taken root in her chest. She carefully packed the financial instruments into her tote bag, leaving the heavy metal drawer empty. Back in her South Boston apartment, Maggie locked her deadbolt, drew the cheap plastic blinds, and pulled out her father's leather-bound ledger. She spent the next 3 days doing nothing but reading, taking meticulous notes, and tracking the financial web her father had so carefully documented. Richard Sullivan had been a carpenter by trade, but he had a mind like a steel trap. The ledger was a masterclass in forensic accounting. Page after page detailed how Patricia and David had systematically bled Sullivan Builders dry. They had set up a network of shell companies, dummy corporations with names like Apex Logistics and Blue River Consulting, and awarded them massive, multi-million-dollar construction contracts for materials that were never delivered. But the embezzlement was only the tip of the iceberg. As Maggie dug deeper into the final pages, her blood ran cold. David wasn't just stealing money, he was laundering it. The ledger showed clear, undeniable transfers from the shell companies to offshore accounts tied to a notorious New England organized crime syndicate. David had turned her father's proud, legitimate construction empire into a massive washing machine for dirty mob money. Richard's final entry, dated just 3 days before his fatal heart attack, read, "David has compromised the union pensions. If the feds look closely, the company will collapse and thousands of innocent workers will lose their retirements. I am going to the authorities on Monday. I cannot let him destroy my people." He never made it to Monday. Maggie closed the ledger, her knuckles white. The suddenness of her father's heart attack now cast a sinister, horrifying shadow. She needed help. She couldn't take this to the local police, and she certainly couldn't trust Robert Hastings, the estate lawyer, who was either blissfully ignorant or actively complicit. She reached for her phone and dialed the number of William Donovan, a retired FBI financial crimes investigator who had once been her father's closest friend before Patricia had driven him away. "Uncle Bill," Maggie said, when the gruff voice answered on the third ring. "It's Maggie. I have something you need to see, and I need you to help me destroy David Reynolds." William Donovan sat across from Maggie in a dimly lit booth at a discreet diner in Cambridge, the leather ledger resting between them like a live grenade. The retired FBI agent was in his late 60s, with iron gray hair, piercing blue eyes, and a face weathered by decades of chasing white-collar criminals. He had spent the last 2 hours scrutinizing Richard's handwritten notes, cross-referencing the bank routing numbers with his own encrypted laptop. "Richard always was a stubborn, brilliant bastard," Bill muttered, shaking his head in quiet awe. "He did the Bureau's job for us. This is a closed-loop evidentiary chain, Maggie. He's got the wire transfer receipts, the IP addresses David used to authorize the payments, and the dummy corporation tax IDs. Is it enough to put them away?" Maggie asked, her voice hard, stripped of any lingering grief. "Put them away?" Bill laughed a dark, humorless laugh. "Maggie, David has been moving millions for the Rossi crime family. When the feds freeze these offshore accounts, the mob will put a target on David's back before he even sees the inside of a courtroom. As for Patricia, she's signed off on every fraudulent tax return. This is federal racketeering, wire fraud, and money laundering. They are looking at 20 years minimum. Then let's give it to the feds," Maggie said. "I already made the call," Bill replied, sliding his phone across the table. "I reached out to Special Agent Harrison Miller. He's the head of the white-collar division here in Boston. But there's a catch. To make this airtight, we need to seize David's hard drives at the Sullivan Builders headquarters before he realizes Richard knew everything and shreds the servers." Maggie thought for a moment, her mind racing. "They are hosting a massive gala this Friday night at the Fairmont Copley Plaza," she said, remembering a society column she had read in the Boston Globe. "Patricia is throwing a multi-million-dollar charity ball to officially announce the rebranding of the company to Reynolds and Sullivan. David, Patricia, and all their cronies will be in the ballroom. Bill smiled, a predatory gleam in his eye, which means the executive offices downtown will be completely empty. The FBI can execute a quiet, no-knock warrant on the servers while David is busy drinking champagne. But David is paranoid, Maggie countered. If his security company alerts him that the servers are being breached, he has a kill switch on his phone. He bragged about it once. He can wipe the remote hard drives from anywhere. Then we need him distracted, Bill said, leaning forward. Completely, entirely distracted. He can't look at his phone for at least 45 minutes while the tech team clones the drives. Maggie looked down at her hands. The image of Patricia dabbing her dry eyes at the will reading flashed in her mind. The sound of David's cruel laughter over the $1 bill echoed in her ears. I'll distract them, Maggie said softly. Maggie, these people are dangerous. If David figures out, He won't, Maggie interrupted, looking up with fierce, burning determination. They think I'm a broken, penniless social worker who was just humiliated in front of the entire legal establishment. They think they crushed me. I am going to walk into that gala, and I'm going to make sure David Reynolds doesn't take his eyes off me for a single second. Over the next 3 days, Maggie transformed. The $12 million cashier's check had cleared into a secure, private account Bill had helped her establish. For the first time in her life, Maggie leaned into the immense power of her father's wealth. She visited an exclusive boutique on Newbury Street, walking past the racks of modest office wear and straight into the couture section. She purchased a breathtaking, tailored Tom Ford pantsuit in a deep, commanding emerald green, the exact color of her father's old toolbox. She bought a pair of Christian Louboutin stilettos that clicked against the pavement like warning shots, and she had a professional stylist cut her long, messy hair into a sharp, intimidating bob. When she looked in the mirror on Friday evening, she barely recognized herself. Gone was the timid girl who desperately sought her father's approval. Staring back was Richard Sullivan's true heir, a woman forged in steel and ready for war. Across town, inside the penthouse suite of the Fairmont Copley Plaza, David Reynolds was pacing nervously, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke tuxedo. Something is wrong, Mother, David snapped, staring out the window at the Boston skyline. I was going through the final estate appraisals today. The liquidator finished with the house. But Richard's personal accounts, his private stock portfolios, and the bearer bonds he bought in the 90s, they are completely empty. Patricia, dripping in diamonds that had been paid for by stolen pension funds, waved a dismissive hand. Richard was losing his mind at the end, David. He probably made bad investments, or he hid it. It doesn't matter. We control the company now. Tonight, we erase his name from the letterhead forever. David frowned, pulling his phone from his pocket and checking his encrypted banking app. I don't like it. If someone finds that money. Who? Patricia scoffed, pouring herself a glass of Cristal. Maggie? She was too busy crying over a $1 bill to notice anything. She's a pathetic, weak, little girl. Put your phone away, David. It's time to go downstairs and show Boston who owns this city now. Downstairs, the grand ballroom was a sea of glittering chandeliers, flowing champagne, and Boston's elite. Photographers lined the red carpet near the entrance, snapping pictures of politicians, developers, and socialites. At exactly 8 p.m., a sleek black chauffeured Maybach pulled up to the curb outside the Fairmont. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Maggie Sullivan stepped onto the pavement. She adjusted the lapels of her emerald suit, checked her watch to ensure Bill's FBI team was in position downtown, and walked up the red carpet. The trap was set, and she was about to spring it. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung open, and the low hum of classical string music was instantly drowned out by the sudden, collective intake of breath from the socialites nearest the entrance. Maggie Sullivan did not just walk into the Fairmont Copley Plaza. She commanded it. The emerald green Tom Ford suit draped perfectly over her frame, providing a sharp, breathtaking contrast to the sea of predictable black tuxedos and pastel ball gowns. Her Louboutin heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble, echoing through the room like the ticking of a metronome counting down to 0. She spotted them immediately. Patricia was holding court near the towering ice sculpture in the center of the room, dripping in stolen diamonds, while David stood beside her, attempting to charm a group of powerful state senators. As Maggie approached, the crowd naturally parted, anxious murmurs rippling through the elite guests. David glanced over his crystal champagne flute, his polite, manufactured smile freezing instantly. For a split second, he truly did not recognize the striking, imposing woman walking toward him. When realization finally set in, the color completely drained from his face. Patricia's jaw visibly tightened, her manicured fingers gripping her glass so hard, the thin stem looked ready to snap. "Hello, Patricia," Maggie said, her voice remarkably smooth, pitched just loud enough for the curious senators to hear. "David, I hope I'm not late for the grand rebranding announcement." David stepped forward, his panicked eyes darting around the room to see who was watching. "Maggie, what on earth are you doing here? This is an exclusive, invitation-only event. Security must have made a mistake at the door." "Oh, there was no mistake," Maggie replied effortlessly, picking a flute of champagne from a passing waiter's silver tray. She took a slow, deliberate sip. "I bought a VIP table under a private trust. I wouldn't miss the celebration of my father's legacy for the world. Though, I must admit, I find the name Reynolds and Sullivan incredibly insulting." David's hand twitched defensively toward his jacket pocket, where his phone and the encrypted kill switch to the company servers sat waiting. Maggie noticed the frantic movement immediately. She needed him focused solely on her for the next half hour. "Speaking of my father," Maggie continued, stepping closer, aggressively invading his personal space. "Did you know he had a rather extensive collection of antique gold certificates? Fascinating things. Completely untraceable." David froze, his hand slipping away from his pocket. His pupils dilated in sheer horror. "What did you just say?" "Gold certificates, David. And bearer bonds," Maggie whispered, her eyes locking onto his with absolute lethal intent, worth tens of millions of dollars. "But you already knew that, didn't you? Or rather, you noticed they were mysteriously missing from his personal ledgers this morning." Patricia stepped in, her heavily powdered face flushed with sudden, undeniable panic. "Maggie, you are drunk and making a scene. I will have you escorted out this instant by security." "If you call security, Patricia, I will stand on that stage and tell every reporter in this room exactly why Richard Sullivan left his biological daughter $1 Maggie countered, her voice dropping to an icy, terrifying timbre. "I will tell them about the false bottom in his old Stanley toolbox. I will tell them exactly what was hidden inside." David completely forgot about the extravagant gala. He forgot about the state senators, the expensive champagne, and the corporate rebranding. His mind was entirely consumed by the absolute terror radiating from Maggie's eerily calm demeanor. "You found the toolbox," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "You have no idea what you're meddling in, Maggie. That money belongs to the estate. It belongs to me." "Does it?" Maggie smiled, casually checking her watch. 20 minutes had passed. She needed 25 more, because according to the bank manager, it was left exclusively to me. Just like the ledgers. You remember the ledgers, don't you, David? The ones detailing your little arrangement with Apex Logistics and Blue River Consulting. Patricia gasped, stumbling backwards slightly as if she had been physically struck by a heavy blow. David's face turned a mottled, furious red. He aggressively grabbed Maggie by the elbow, his grip painfully bruising. "Listen to me, you little brat," David growled, his voice trembling with unhinged rage. "You are going to walk out of this hotel, get into my car, and bring me every single piece of paper you found. If you don't, people far more dangerous than you can ever imagine are going to bury you in a landfill." "Are you threatening my life in front of the governor, David?" Maggie asked softly, nodding toward the politician standing just a few feet away, watching the tense exchange.